Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Welcome to Sense and Sustainability. I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. Today I'm delighted to introduce John Morrison from the Institute of Human Rights and Business. Welcome, John.
Hi, Sean. Nice to be here.
So, John, can you tell us a bit about your background and how you became involved in this whole world of human rights?
My goodness. I remember seeing my careers officer at school when I was 14, who told me I should be a policeman, I think, if I remember all the way back. I mean, it certainly wasn't something that came out of the big shoebox of cards that we had to go through to choose what we should do with our lives. This wasn't one of the options. I actually studied archaeology at university and anthropology, and I through that got an interest in societies around the world. I spent time abroad teaching English and doing other things. And I think it's because of all that I found myself working with refugees and refugee protection in my 20s in relation to the former Yugoslavia. And I was deputy coordinator of the UK Bosnia program at the British Refugee Council. And that was really the deep end of the swimming pool, really. I mean, horrible things that people had suffered and the support they needed. And then I had a Harkness Fellowship to the States in the mid-90s, 1990s, which was a great honor, and it gave me some exposure to Bill Clinton's presidency and some of his cabinet. And I became very interested in multi-stakeholder coalitions, particularly then around immigration and asylum and refugee policy. But I came back to Europe with ideas of how civil society could connect with business around common cause. And that's something I didn't believe in before I went to America. I was pretty distrustful of business. And then I managed to work with Anita Roddick and her husband Gordon, founders of The Body Shop, at a personal level and their foundation to begin with, and then eventually joined the company in the last of the good years, as I often used to say. And incredible opportunity there to have global partnerships with Amnesty International, with Greenpeace International, etc., on a range of issues. And I could sort of, test out some of the ideas I'd picked up in America, and then segued from that into something called the Business Leaders Initiative on Human Rights, chaired by Mary Robinson, who kindly agreed to chair it just after leaving the UN, former president of Ireland. And that created at least a bit of a space for businesses to be at least agnostic, if not positive, about the proposition that human rights has anything to do with their business. And of course, John Ruggie started his mandate at the UN, and we were a useful thing for him. And then in 2009 was one of several people that helped establish the Institute for Human Rights in Business as a more impartial global think tank. And that's where I've been since, Sean. So that's my whole career in a nutshell there.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. And obviously we met for the first time through my role on the London Olympics, and got together starting to think about the something that eventually became the Centre for Human Rights and Sport.
Yes, in Geneva, yes. And I think you used to call it the Palace of Enlightenment, Sean. I remember just at the back end of the London Olympics, sitting around tables, building things out of Lego.
Lego, that's right, yeah, absolutely.
And you saying that what we need is a house of enlightenment, and I think that's what we've tried to build in Geneva. I'm not sure we've delivered enough enlightenment yet, but we're trying. Yeah.
At least we managed to get that organisation off the ground, because clearly, one of the things that came out of my experience on London 2012 and some of the fantastic things that were done, the whole issue of human rights wasn't really addressed as well as it could have been. I mean, there were lots of things around environmental sustainability, regeneration, legacy, all of those things that I think stand up as an example still, and looking at Paris claiming to be the greenest games ever, it probably was. But that was achieved through using a lot of existing venues, whereas actually London was very different. So to quote Ken Livingstone, it was a 200-year regeneration project interrupted by 6 weeks of sport. But, of all the great things that were done, it was really good to work with you and to take forward the whole human rights thing into the sport arena.
Well, you were the genesis of that, Sean, because you made it very clear that on the environmental side, you had the ability to hand over knowledge both to the International Olympic Committee and then also the organisers of the Rio Games in 2016. But for the social side of stuff, particularly human rights, there was nowhere to go. There was no one to hand it on to. So in a sense, you passed the torch to us.
Yeah.
Of all people, and then we had to build a building to pass it on to. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, John, I'm very aware that you've published a book quite recently, and also that you've got some thoughts on this whole topic of just transition, which I think is a term that people are starting to bandy around these days, but I'm not sure it's as well understood as it should be. Would you like to talk about that? Because I know you've got some amazing thoughts on this whole topic.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I wrote the book, I think. The book comes out at the end of October, The Just Transition, a Systems Thinking Approach to Climate Action, Macmillan publisher. And I wrote it primarily for that reason, Sean, that it is a term, it's a paradigm that has been around actually for longer than you think, 40, 50 years, but has sort of was in the preamble to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 and has really gathered pace over recent years, but has become a term that has begun to mean everything to everyone in different, and the worry is that because of that vagueness, the term comes into disrepute. It's a bit like TSR, if you remember years ago. TSR meaning anything, basically. And the inflation of the term ESG would be another example.
ESG can mean anything these days, can't it? ESG is the new CSR.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to finances, there is a seriousness to ESG, but it's obviously some people use it as a synonym to sustainability these days, and it's not. And so, I really tried to I wrote a book on social license a few years ago and tried to pin that back to social contract theory. And in a way, I was trying to pin just transition to something. So, I mean, obviously pinning it down to what the International Labour Organization has said and now what UNFCCC says. But I found it almost essential quite early on to think about it from a systems perspective. So what I pin it to, as well as all the legal stuff, conceptually, I pin it to systems thinking. And I mean, I'll talk about in a minute why that's essential, but you don't get very far, I think, with just transition if you don't think about it systemically.
So when you talk about systems thinking and looking at just transition systemically, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we could all agree that just transition more or less means the social impact of climate action, that the action we have to take to reach net zero by 2050 will not just have environmental and financial implications, but it will have a social, Now, clearly there should be a big upside because we're saving humanity, right? And I guess that the wider climate justice movement has been talking about that and how the victims of climate change tend to be the people who are least responsible for causing it, right? And so there's a huge inequity around the world. So that's the sort of the broader framing. But within that, the action we have to take will also have social implications. And I think we've heard a lot about the upside there, green jobs for everyone, a shiny new green future, which of course is what we aim towards. But there'll be real costs along the way. And you just have to think back. I mean, I went to Sheffield University in the 1980s, slam bang in the middle of the miners' strike. And, I got to see from my own sort of political work in those days just how much mining families were suffering from a transition out of coal that was driven not by environmental considerations then, but by economics and political ideology. But that's a really that's a good example of an unjust transition. So it's quite easy to point to unjust transitions and the dislocation that can cause for generations, right? So it's clear that if we are going to transition out of coal, transition out of much of oil and gas, decarbonize the built environment, decarbonize agriculture, these are huge things. They would be a lot if they were just happening in one place at one time. But the challenge of the next 25 years is everything has to happen everywhere, everything everywhere all at once, to quote a movie title. And we've never seen that. So we're talking literally about hundreds and thousands of transitions all at once, the aggregate and cumulative effect of which no one has really calculated. And that's why the systems thinking piece is really essential. Because if we just look at the transition that a single company has to do to cleanse its balance sheet of carbon, and we've seen a number of European mining companies do this, often that carbon isn't taken out of the system at all. It's just acquired by other mining companies elsewhere. Very few coal mines have yet to be really closed, right? I mean, of course, they have been in some places, including our own country. But you don't, the behavior of a single company or even a single government is not as sufficient, and actually can just push the problem to another place in the system. So you really have to work through the system all at once. And that is why a systems thinking approach is absolutely critical to the transition ahead. And if we're to understand the impact on people, whether that be the workers or consumers who are worried about energy and food security, or communities around the mines or around the green power installations, or indigenous peoples in supply chains, etc., we have to think about them in that broader systemic context too. Otherwise, we won't be able to protect their interests. Yeah.
So how can that be made to work? So you've explained kind of what you mean by systems thinking. And I think it's a really interesting idea. As you say, you close one coal mine, but then people still buy coal, so they just buy it from another mine, and that doesn't solve the problem. But we're talking about some very complex multinational sectors here, aren't we? And as you say, it can't be solved by a single organisation or a single government. How do you see the way forward?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to do is not to hide from the complexity, right? I mean, it can be daunting, the fact that everything is interrelated and interconnected. And I can understand why many people, we're all paid to be in our silos, and to step out of your silo is a scary thing to do. And you might not be rewarded for doing so. Politicians are not rewarded for talking about the true complexity of the world in which we live in. And I would argue business leaders who are worried about financial returns to shareholders are also not rewarded by talking about complexity. So there are lots of reasons why people don't want to acknowledge the complexity publicly. I mean, I think privately most people do understand how complex things really are. But acknowledging the complexity is important. And then finding within that complexity the points of leverage. I would call them the pinch points, where the different parts of the system, the different interests of different actors come into tension. Predicting where those are and building collective action around them. And I mean, for example, if you take the UK renewables, we heard a lot about this coming up to the election, that there was a 10-year wait to plug in a renewable asset to the national grid in the UK. Clearly, that's a pinch point. Why would you want to invest in wind and solar if you can't actualize?
If you can't actually sell the electricity.
We talk about stranded assets in terms of coal mining at the end of the lifespan of coal, but the stranded assets in renewables are
at the beginning.
Because you can't plug them in. So, it's good that the new government is prioritizing planning reform, and this stuff is going to be controversial. It's going to, this is going to have a social impact. It's going to impact in the lives of people, particularly communities, and their worries about how their environments might change in terms of the building that's going to go on. But that is not only is it essential that we remove the pinch points, right? But it's also absolutely critical that we develop a narrative to explain why we need to do that. And I think that I've yet to see that from the new government. They're pushing through planning reforms essentially so that we can unblock the pinch points. But you've got to describe to people why it's essential that the transition, that there will be pain in the transition, but that pain is as shared across society as possible and as equitably distributed as possible. And there's a fairness involved in the transition, because I think if people feel that there's a fairness and everyone's in it, then people will bear the pain. If they don't feel that, if they feel that there's an urban elite that's not really touched and it's people in the rural areas that are picking up the impact, the poorer communities, then, or farmers, particularly in agriculture, we haven't really seen that in this country yet, but in Europe already, farmers are very angry and concerned. They feel they're the pinch point in the agricultural transition. If those people don't understand, and if society doesn't step in and bear the load on their behalf, not only will we have a lot of unrest and pushback, but we won't reach net zero by 2050 because the whole train will come off the tracks. People will vote for governments that don't even believe in climate change, right? So that this is now a realization that I think governments have only come to very recently. I wish that just transition had been discussed 20 years ago in climate negotiations. It's only really the past 3 or 4 years, I'd say, that it at the COP meetings that it has real airtime. But I think it's growing to become one of the most important issues in the whole climate agenda. And that's, again, why I wrote the book, because I think it needs to be promoted and much better understood quickly. Yeah.
You give one example of pinch points, but I know that in your head, and you talk in the book about others. Are there other examples, maybe on
there's pinch points everywhere, and I think I was involved a little bit in the in one of the working groups for our TPT, our Transition Plan Task Force, that the Treasury, the previous government, commissioned, which now claims to be the gold standard in corporate climate transition planning. And it's very good, right? And they did endeavor to take a systemic approach, but they didn't go wide and deep enough. I mean, they didn't take enough interest in just transition and the social impact, and they didn't really go wide enough in terms of global supply chains. And just to give an example, energy transition minerals, we can talk about circular economies and local transition, but technology enables everything we're talking about. And the trebling of transmission lines, the investments in batteries and cars, there are certain minerals that need to be dug out of the ground to make that possible, even within the best scenarios around recycling and reuse, right? So, for example, copper. The predictions are that we're probably going to need more copper by 2043 than has ever been dug out of the ground in human history. And we have to remember the Bronze Age was essentially the Copper Age with a bit of tin added. And, so 5,000, well, maybe 7,000 years of humans using copper, we need to dig out of the ground in the next, 16, 17 years, more copper than human history to meet the transition requirements. Again, the whole world's transitioning all at the same time. Everybody wanting copper, lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel, etc. Now, there might be an element that some of these, predictions can be diminished through better recycling and reuse, or cobalt might get replaced in 10 years' time by another transition metal or another chemical. But fundamentally, you know what I'm talking about. And the pinch point is the fact that we're moving into a world with fragmented trade, where there are more sanctions and embargoes than in recent memory. So you immediately then creating, and people and governments and businesses are trying to securitize their supply chains rather than just buying and selling off the global market. So that's going to lead to oversupply and overpricing. And then where are these new mining sites? 54% of them are in indigenous lands around the world. All the easy mining has been done, right? We've been exploiting copper for a very long time. We might reopen some mines in Cornwall. We might, right, for tin, copper, etc. But most of this is in Latin America and other places in indigenous lands. So they are a pinch point. I mean, or the pinch point is coming their way. How do we ensure that they get some equity and justice in the transition ahead, and that they are part of the conversation? There was very little reference to them in the UK's transition planning task force work, and yet they, in a sense, are an integral partner in a transition thousands of miles away here, because without their consent, in a sense, we will not have the transition minerals we need to get to net zero by 2050. So despite all the nationalism and jingoism that gets wrapped up in these conversations, we are in each other's pocket. China, for example, as well. A trade war with China that Trump might inspire next year. There is no way to net zero by 2050 if there's a major trade war between China and the US. China supplies the majority of solar and wind energy technology to the world and to itself. We don't have time to develop parallel supply chains all over the world and still reach 2050. So global trade is a we don't save the planet if we destroy global trade and these things. So again, another example of how interdependent everything is at the moment. Yeah.
So going back to the example of copper, so your issue is the massive uplift in the demand for copper. It's not that there isn't copper in the ground. It's a question of where it is and the impact of the communities from which that copper needs to be extracted. And for me, that's a really good example of a just transition.
Yes, I mean, copper is a dirty metal. I mean, the processing of copper, anybody in mining can tell you that there's always contaminants. It's a messy business, copper. And most of the copper that's in the world at the moment is still being used. It's not as if there's, we can strip out a load of copper and reuse it, because we're still using it. And
it's value, doesn't it? So, you don't
value, and it's still,
you don't landfill copper.
No, you don't landfill copper. It is very easy to recycle. Yeah. So it's not the recyclability of copper that's the issue, as it is with some other commodities. It is the fact that most of the copper that's out there at the moment, we still use it for electrification and other purposes, because, other than silver and a few other elements that are more expensive, it is the element of choice when it comes to the transmission of electricity, and remains so. And therefore, it's not, circular economy thinking gets you so far, but we need more copper.
And there is no alternative, is there, if you want to transmit electricity?
At the moment, as far as I understand it, and if you talk about burying cables underground so that you don't have unsightly pylons, you're going to need even more of these commodities to insulate, and because it's less efficient to transmit energy underground than it is through the air, through pylons above ground. I mean, if there are technologies that are going to replace this, they're not going to be, as I understand it, we won't have. They're not going to be enough of the answer for the 2050 requirements. They're not going to come around soon enough. We are moving, of course, with the transition to a energy system that is purely based on electrons, right? Whether it's nuclear energy, hydroelectric, solar, whatever, it's about all of these things are turned into electricity at some point, which is different from the coal-based or the petrol-based energy systems we've had that have sort of ran parallel with our electrical systems. We're closing those down, right, for carbon reasons. And that's why the whole infrastructure question is such a pinch point in every country.
Yeah. So, the future's electric. Thanks very much, John. Fascinating insight into your background and career and some of your thoughts on Just Transition. This is part 1 of 2 podcasts with John. Very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts in part 2. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.